Not that radio didn't always suck, but radio music really sucks now.
It's speaking to a different generation. That's the thing. It's like,
what's it saying? If it's speaking to a different generation, tell me what it's saying.
It's from my understanding, it's vibing.
He runs as though the devil himself is in pursuit. And well he might, for he saw what no man has ever seen before.
It's on its way. The man on the main gate had it just like the others. It's coming in on the west side. Look! There it is, on the roof!
3 experts in science and security lead a band of men who try to find a way to exterminate X, the unknown terror. Only to find a tunnel of fear, from which there is no escape. Dean Jagger as Professor Royston, top secret scientist. Edward Chapman, Elliot, in charge of lab operations. Leo McKern, Inspector McGill, security officer.
Peter, don't go any closer! Peter, don't go any closer! Peter!
Welcome back to Geek Channel 8. I'm Eric.
And I'm John. Dear God, season 4, episode 8 of Succession. I don't recommend watching it at 1 a.m. My nerves were shot by the end of the episode. I couldn't get to sleep afterwards. Also watching The Last Drive-In, the Joe Bob Briggs special. And I was actually really happy because they showed the Mutilator on there. And I just worked on the sequel last year. So when that was over, they were giving a shout out that saying, hey, there's a sequel that's done. And maybe there might be a streaming service looking to send it. So I was like, oh my God, did we just get distribution on their show?
Nice. I plan to go to the drive-in tonight.
Nice.
So it's the first weekend the drive-in is open this year. It is a double feature. Fast X is the first feature.
All right.
Cocaine Bear is the other film.
I love that double billing right there.
Is that not a great double billing? That's drive-in for you, right?
That is drive-in. Ultimate drive-in, yes.
And I have been watching The Diplomat. Kerry Russell is a foreign service officer who becomes the ambassador to the UK during a crisis. It's great, but I can only take it in doses of 1 or 2 episodes a night. And now I really want to see Kerry Russell getting attacked by a bear. So that's why I'm going to Cocaine Bear. And I had seen all the Fast and Furious films up until they spun off Hobbs and Shaw, and I did not watch that one. I still haven't seen that one. So I'd seen up through 8. And then I said, okay, well, if I'm going to go see Fast X at the drive-in, I got to watch F9, the Fast Saga, or whatever it's called.
The Fate of the Furious.
Fate of the Furious was before that.
Oh, no, yeah. Good God. Yeah, what is it called? Yeah, because Fate, they shot part of that in Cleveland. I remember that.
Yeah, you guys, I'm jealous of all the films you get nowadays in Hawaii. Like when I was there was no work to be had. F9, the Fast Saga is what it's called.
Title.
Yeah. I have to say that F9 is probably the weakest. There's a low bar.
It sounds like it, yeah.
There's already a low bar with the Fast and the Furious franchise, but the stuff is like more ridiculous and more unbelievable. A lot of stuff just doesn't make sense. How did they get there now,
It's funny you mentioned that because like I was like, wait, what was the hell was part 9 even about? And I was like, oh, that's the one that has the trailer where like the car is on a vine and swings across a cliff or something, right?
Yes. So
Oh.
so what happens is, imagine Indiana Jones, and I'm sure this is where they got the idea. Remember in Temple of Doom where they're on that rickety bridge and Short Round's like, hold on, lady, we going for a ride. that bit, you know.
Future Oscar winner, yes.
Yeah. And Indy like slashes the bridge with a sword and it collapses and it goes swinging down. Okay, it's that except for with a car. All right? So the car is going across the bridge. Now, that would be fine except for that the bridge has been cut at one end and they're falling, yet the car is still driving vertically up the bridge and like goes up in the air and like lands on the ground. All right. And so like it's stuff like that. And then people will fall from like the top of a skyscraper, but as long as they land on a car, they're okay. Yeah. There's no such thing as getting killed by a car in the Fast and Furious saga. As long as you touch a car, it's like home base and tag when you were a kid. Like you're safe as soon as you touch the car, you know?
Yeah, well, everyone knows that car roofs are just like, you know, stunt pads, right?
Or
you can fall off anything.
It doesn't have to be the roof. As long as you're in contact with a car in some way, you are safe.
Those hoods are probably like Wayne Technologies from The Dark Knight.
Okay, so then there's later in the series where they like go into space. I am not kidding you. They go into space in a Pontiac.
I heard about that.
There is an unironically delivered line in this film. And this is the one line that actually had me laughing out loud, which I don't think was supposed to be intentionally a joke in the movie. But they're like, Ludacris or something?
Ludacris, yeah.
He's the scientist guy in their group. And
sure, why not?
He's like, says to the other guy, like, you know, the other guy's freaking out that they're going to die or whatever. And he's like, as long as we follow the laws of physics, everything will be okay. And I'm like, that made me laugh out loud because nothing in the whole movie followed the laws of physics. And that coming off the bridge thing was just one example.
It's Gore Verbinski logic.
Oh, man. Also, there's now so many damn characters in this film that I can't even keep track of them all. Like, wasn't Gal Gadot in like the last episode? But where is she now?
No, yeah, she's in like a few of the movies too, and it's like, okay, where is she now? I don't know. She probably left to be Wonder Woman, and then like, oh, well, we have to write her off somehow.
So people come and go all the time from this franchise. So there's like some guy that died in like Fast 6 who pops back up in this one, and there's more than one person that died that came back, and then there are people that were supposed to be here that weren't here. You know, it's just kind of doesn't make any sense.
I'll never forget when they kill off Michelle Rodriguez and like 2 movies later they bring her back, and it's just like it's like that Truman Show moment. It's like, oh, how are you going to explain your father's absence? Amnesia.
Well, I probably wouldn't watch the show if it weren't for Michelle Rodriguez. I always wanted to date the cool girl, but never got to date the cool girl. You know, so like, so she's not the prettiest girl in the bunch by far. She has to share screen with the likes of Gal Gadot, but she is the true badass of the movies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, okay, enough about the Fast and the Furious. Like, how did we end up in a world where there's like 10 Fast and the Furious films, and yet like we've spent too much time on this already? We need to get into today's movie, X the Unknown.
All right, let's do it.
This movie came out in 1956, so I want to give a little background of the year, as we do on this podcast. January 1st of 1956, the Republic of Sudan gained independence from Egypt and the United Kingdom, which jointly controlled it. Now, all these years later, we'll see how well that's working out for them. February 5th, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is released and becomes the most watched movie of 1956. Between March 18th and 20th, the worst March blizzard of the century hits New Jersey, southern New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, with snow drifts up to 14 feet high. 162 people die. April 14th, videotape is first demonstrated at the 1956 NARTB, modern-day NAB, convention in Chicago by Ampex. It is the demonstration of the first practical and commercially successful videotape format, known as 2-inch quadruplex. May 22nd, the NBC Peacock logo debuts on television in the United States. Peacock, by the way, soon to be the better streaming service than HBO Max. I always make fun of Peacock as being like the suckiest of the streaming services. But soon, that's what they want to make HBO Max into, is Peacock. Bunch of reality TV bullshit.
That's what you get when you get the Discovery person in charge.
June 21st, playwright Arthur Miller appears before the House Un-American Activities Committee in Washington, D.C. July 2nd, a laboratory experiment involving scrap thorium at Sylvania Electric Products in Bayside, New York, results in an explosion. July 13th, John McCarthy of Dartmouth, Marvin Minsky of MIT, Claude Shannon of Bell Labs, and Nathaniel Rochester of IBM assemble the first coordinated research meeting on the topic of artificial intelligence at Dartmouth College, Hanover, New Hampshire, in the United States.
Harbinger of things to come.
August 6th, after going bankrupt in 1955, the American broadcaster Dumont Television Network airs its final broadcast, an episode of the sports series Boxing from St. Nicholas Arena. Somehow, I didn't know or completely forgot that there was a television network other than ABC and the two NBCs and one later CBS, that there was another network, Dumont. I did not know that.
No, me neither. Like, I knew there was like some syndicated service or something out there at the time, but I didn't know.
Apparently Jackie Gleason was signed to them, and most of their recordings are completely lost because they were shot on film, which was then looted for the silver in it. Film was combustible back then, and what wasn't rated for its silver was destroyed in a fire. So there are very few recordings of Dumont that actually exist.
Wow.
September 13th, the hard drive is invented by an IBM team led by Reynold B. Johnson. In October, the world's first industrial-scale commercial nuclear power plant is opened at Calder Hall in England. November 3rd, The Wizard of Oz is the first major Hollywood film running more than 90 minutes to be televised uncut in one evening in the United States.
And so it begins.
And then November 5th, X the Unknown is released.
Hearing all of this stuff that you were mentioning that is going on in 1956, after watching it, X the Unknown is like incredibly timely.
Yes, it is. And we will get into that in a moment. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what went into the making of this film? We mentioned in last episode that this was supposed to be the next Quatermass film, but that didn't happen. So go ahead and tell.
I'm just going to say this. I'm envious of you getting production notes for Quatermass Experiment, because the Hammer films held that one in a lot higher regard than the production of this one. I had to fight to find any information on this one. They're very plentiful with how much they were providing with memories and stories of Quatermass Experiment. But when it came to this one, and as you'll hear, there's some interesting stories about why they don't like to look fondly back on it. Even just trying to find out the budget was a bit of a head scratcher for me. Wikipedia says that the budget for X the Unknown was $60,000, but they also reference a Variety article that said that, article stated, and this is the exact quote, evidence of growing production costs, Quatermass 2 is roughly 60% above that of the Quatermass Experiment, which costs $140,000. That was directly from Variety in
They're
1957.
making you do math.
They made me do math and conversions. Like, what the hell?
They don't want to tell you the budget. They're like, oh, it was 60% more than.
Yeah, it's like, no. It's like, either way, more than the 60,000 that Wikipedia was stating, but I'll go into that later. X the Unknown is from a first-time screenwriter, Jimmy Sangster, who would later go on to become a co-writer or rewriter for Hammer Studios, would work on stuff like The Curse of Frankenstein and Horror of Dracula. So while the film was supposed to be a direct sequel to Quatermass Xperiment, the author, Nigel Neal, refused permission for the character of Bernard Quatermass to be used. The character was changed to atomic energy scientist Dr. Adam Royston, played by Dean Jagger, which was funny because we had a little bit of a topic talking about Bernard Quatermass's portrayal in the film in the last one, where I liked it. I was like, yeah, I can see why the author is upset, but you kind of like the Captain Kirk aspect of him. And I was like, well, that would come around to bite them on a sequel here.
Brian Dunleavy. We'll talk about Brian Dunleavy versus Dean Jagger, who plays Adam Royston. Anyway, continue.
Okay. So, and again, when you mentioned Arthur Miller appearing before the Senate committee, there was also a director who had to relocate to the UK just to find work. His name was Joseph Lucy, who began filming X the Unknown, but as production went on, he was replaced with another director, Leslie Norman. There are two reasons that have been given for it. The first one was he fell ill and needed to be replaced. But the other one was that the star, Dean Jagger, refused to work with them because he was placed on the Hollywood blacklist. So little column A, little column B. I'm guessing he probably had a fever one day, and all of a sudden they said, yep, we got to replace him.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. I think it's probably a little bit of both here.
Yeah. But the director they replaced him with, Leslie Norman, he didn't have very good of a time either. He wasn't excited about working on the project. He took it just because paycheck. That was literally it. He would actually go on to say, and here's my exact quote, hated working at Hammer because he never got along with the producer, Anthony Hins. As other stories went on, you'd find out that, man, Dean Jagger just did not like working with people, did he? Jagger did not like working with him, but also other crew members didn't like working with him, and the heads of Hammer didn't like working with him. So,
from what I've heard, he was one of those directors that used profanity, shouted through a megaphone all the time. And that's just not the way the Brits do things.
The script described the monster as being, quote, made up of millions of writhing worm-like segments. And because of not only the film's budget, but the technology at the time, a lot of the stuff that was in the description of the script could not be filmed as such. So we got the monster, which we'll talk about when we talk about the film as well. This one also got an X rating from the board at the UK, just like Quatermass Xperiment.
Is that why they called it X the Unknown?
Yeah, it is. Like, I think they just were like, you know what? Fine. We're just going to keep getting X ratings. We're just going to lean into this whole X thing. So it's X the Unknown. You said, what was it? X the Unknown was released in November of 56?
November 5th. Yeah.
November 5th. Okay. It was actually supposed to come out that March of 1956 because RKO was in their final stages and they were about to completely go under. They were hashing out like the distribution rights between Warner Brothers because X the Unknown got distributed in the United States by Warner Brothers. Honestly, between the fact that it had like two directors, two distribution companies, it's a marvel that this movie was as successful as it was, or just was as good as it was.
Speaking of Quatermass Xperiment, that was the last film under their deal with Robert Lippert. So they were finally free of that deal, and they were going to get a major US studio to distribute them, RKO. And then suddenly RKO is bankrupt.
Since RKO actually funded, I want to say they funded 60,000 or 30,000. Either way, they covered enough to make sure that they had a US star in the role, which was Dean Jagger. He was like 6 years off of winning a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for 12 O'Clock High. And I think And a lot of people also might know him as well, as he was the Major General from White Christmas. So
Okay. Yeah.
this is the first time like I watched one of these movies with my wife. She sat and watched. Was like, hey, I know that guy, because she loves White Christmas.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about White Christmas because it snowed here this past week. So for those who don't know, I'm in Vermont. White Christmas, the whole plot of the film's about, is it going to snow in Vermont? Okay. Right now we're recording this thing and it's almost Memorial Day here, and it snowed a few days ago.
We still have the heat on in our house here, and it's like middle of May, and it's
And
It's
you're
cold.
in Kentucky.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let's get into this film itself. It opens on the moors in Scotland, and there's this army unit learning how to detect radiation with Geiger counters, which makes sense given the time. You know, it's like, this is going to be the new truth about war. You know, this is about 10 years after the Hiroshima bombing. So this is the new reality that soldiers need to train with this. And there's one soldier who's, you know, not the greatest. So they like tried to skip him. They're hiding this little radioactive marker, and then the soldiers have to find it, you know, using the Geiger counter. And like, everybody's like, okay, we'll do this last one. And while they're not paying attention, he finds a reading which is nowhere near where it's supposed to be. So finally they go check his Geiger counter, and in fact it is working. Then there's an explosion and the ground opens up.
And thus begins the film.
They have to quarantine the area, and they call in the American scientist, Dr. Adam Royston. He's the chief atomic scientist working at the Lockmuth Research Lab in Lockmuth, Scotland, which I don't know if it's a real place, but I'm guessing it is. I don't know.
I wrote it down as cabin with a pane of glass.
It might be real for all I know. I noticed in the very beginning of this movie, they thanked the War Office. And I think they had real soldiers and stuff like that. So I can only assume that their research lab was also real. I don't know. But it does look really like a cabin. Dr. Royston is essentially Professor Quatermass under a different name. Remember, they had changed him to a doctor in previous versions of Quatermass Experiment script, and then changed him back to a professor. So Dr. Adam Royston, this time played by Dean Jagger. Fans sometimes refer to this film as Quatermass 1.5 because for all intents and purposes, it is a Quatermass film.
Right.
There's, aside from the character not being called Quatermass, everything, it looks and talks like a Quatermass film.
It's Never Say Never Again.
It is Never Say Never Again. It is. The only thing that makes it different from that is that Never Say Never Again had the original guy come back, and this is like a new guy.
True, right.
So, when Royston arrives, there's no longer a radioactivity, which is very strange because you would expect if there's radioactivity in the area, it would continue to remain.
It's supposed to linger, yeah.
Yeah. There's just this bottomless Y-shaped crevice in the earth.
They should have had like an extra split just to like seal the X home there.
Yeah, that would have been great. That night, there's two boys, Willie Harding and Ian Osborne, and they're like daring each other to go through the woods to this like haunted tower. And there's supposedly a guy named Old Tom that lives there, who's like, you know, crazy old dude, you know. And Willie sees something horrible and Ian runs away. So the boy is taken to the hospital and they're trying to figure out what happened to him. After questioning by Royston, the other boy reveals that they were going to this tower. So he goes to check out the tower. He finds there is a sample container from his workshop. Oh, I should mention the workshop, the lab. He had these little
erector
samples.
set things, yeah.
It was like an erector set. That's exactly what I thought it was. It was like, oh, it looks like he's got an erector. He's got an erector set where he like uses a little pulley
to drop his sample into like the lead case and all that.
they call it trinium. I think it's supposed to be tritium, which is an actual
Right.
radioactive element.
Right.
Some sources refer to it as tritium, some refer to it as trinium.
hmm
I think they were saying trinium, but
I heard trinium too, like with an N instead of a
Yeah.
D. I was like,
either they just made it up or they meant tritium and it was an error.
yeah, still sounds better than unobtainium.
Way better. Way better. So these samples are very similar to what they were burying in the moors for the soldiers. They're just like a little
Right.
metal cylinder or a little cylinder made of this radioactive element. So he finds one of these, the one from his lab, in
Crazy Tom's tower with his
Yeah.
own personal still.
Yeah. So old Tom lives there. There's a guy that's like got a still, and he's
I
the
like that little touches of like Crazy Tom there.
Yeah, actually, it had a lot of stuff like that where it's like
Yeah.
they didn't really explain it. They didn't need to. This is just like, one of the local crazies,
Yeah, and later on in the story, when you find there's moments that require explaining, it's the best meta wink and nod I've heard of in writing as well. Like there's a moment where Royston's in a car and he didn't want it to get out about the pit being bottomless, and his partner that's in the car there, he started to tell other people about the pit being bottomless, and he just goes, "That's very unscientific of him."
Yeah.
I admired that on two levels. I admired that on one, way to wear your sci-fi genre on your sleeve. That's awesome. And in a good way. And that's also a nod that this is the Quatermass that Nigel wanted to
Yep.
begin with, or at least it sounds exactly like that. So, like I said, it's little touches like that in the writing with Crazy Tom that just, it works so, like you said, they have these little moments that work so well for a first-time writer. It's sure of his writing.
I was watching a YouTube video in the last few days about how Kodak knew that the US was doing atomic bomb tests in the Nevada desert before they told anyone that they were doing that. Because in upstate New York or something, they had facilities in like Illinois near Chicago or something and upstate New York. So way far away from the Nevada. On their undeveloped film, they were seeing the result of x-rays.
Really?
And so they're like, they were able to tell what the distance was and stuff like that. And the government came to them and was like, yeah, we're doing this. Keep it quiet. And Kodak did. But if radiation was reaching that far, think of what all was going on. So like the fact that this opens with Geiger counters and all that, and radiation's at the heart of it, is, I think, really timely.
Especially like we were talking about what going on in 1956. Was it the first atomic plant or something was opening?
Yeah. So that was the United Kingdom's Atomic Energy Commission. And there's actually a character from the UK's Atomic Energy Commission that is sent here in the story, Mac McGill, from their internal security division, to come investigate the theft of this trinium that's disappeared from the lab.
Yeah, this is that's the police officer or so, right?
Yeah.
I like him. I liked him in this movie.
And him and Quatermass end up forming a
duo.
Yeah.
Like when you say unlikely crime fighting team, that's what happens. Scientist and detective.
Willie's father is upset and Willie, well, hang on just a second. Let me sound the spoiler alert. The kid dies, which is like, whoa, one of those moments.
Yeah.
And then the father.
Kids are normally safe in these movies.
Yeah. So like for a sci-fi film in the 1950s, for like a kid to die this early in the movie, especially, you're like, whoa.
It's the equivalency of killing a cat in a movie today.
Yeah. So the father accuses him of letting off bombs you can't control. To me, that line is a lot like what was going on, because, they didn't know what the result of some of these bombs were going to be. I remember when they let off like the H bomb or something, they thought that they might like set the stratosphere on fire. Like,
Yeah.
there's like a really small chance that might happen. Well, like how small? Like really, really small. Well, like,
we might burn up this atmospheric layer that's covering our planet with this bomb, but we got to try it.
Yeah, so that's what gets me. It's like they did it anyway. It's like even if the chance is like 1%, half of a percent, it's like that's too high a percentage chance of destroying the whole world.
That is why I will always, like, if I have to list my favorite sci-fi films, I will always list Jurassic Park in there for the one line.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
That's not only sci-fi in a nutshell, but that's also how many things have happened nowadays because of, and again, as 1956, the first meeting about AI.
Yeah. Yep. So
moving on, the kid dies.
All right, so the kid dies. The father accuses them of letting off bombs they can't control, and Adam Royston says, "We only try to create, not destroy."
Right.
Meanwhile, there's a nurse and an intern who decide to use the radiation room to like meet up and have their secret.
Yeah, to have their hookup. Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, like,
oh my God.
Of all the places, you could have picked,
By this point, I started questioning, was it standard practice to deal with any levels of radiation and not have a suit?
I think that actually a lot less was known, especially by the general public, about radiation at that time.
Okay.
I think, so they'll have it behind like a little barrier, but they won't be wearing any protective gear or anything.
It's just like that thin little layer of glass in front of Dr. Royston's experiment there. It kept reminding me of that Robin Williams punchline when he went in for like his CT or his X-ray or whatever. It's like, and they hand you a tiny little bib for your balls. Meanwhile, the doctor goes behind 4 feet of concrete and just goes, "It'll be fine."
They're like making out, and then like the always bad sign in horror film, and this thing blobs in through the HVAC system or something, and
I like that description. It blobs in.
Yeah, and then he basically melts away, which is really cool. What they did was
when we say melt away, like close up of the face melting to the bone away.
Yeah, they covered his face in a wax mask of himself, and they put that on his face, and then they had little heating elements embedded in the wax, and they turned them on so that it literally melted the wax away, and it looks like his face is melting. Super cool. That was one of the things that got him an X rating.
Oh yeah, easily got. When you read the video nasty list and you realize why there's a movie on there, and you see, oh, this scene, that would be the scene as to why. Because again, my wife watched it with me. After that happened, I looked at her, I was like, yeah, the 1950s weren't ready for this level of gore in a movie.
Adam knows that this stuff has the properties of like oil. It's some kind of liquid or viscous fluid kind of thing.
Or mud.
Well, later on we find out it is in fact mud. Which I thought was kind of cool, radioactive mud, because I could almost believe that,
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the thing in Quatermass Xperiment was from space, and I guess I could believe that, because it comes from space, it could be anything. But like the idea that radioactive mud exists, I could believe that actually exists. Like if we were to dig down through the Earth's shell, I feel like if we ran into radioactive mud, it would be like, oh yeah, that's a thing. That's a thing. Now,
exactly.
Would it actually blob after people and seek out more radiation and whatever? I don't know. But Royston, there's one part where he just jumps to this conclusion way ahead of everything. He's like, he's like, obviously, these underground life that we have no conception of, and it's it's a different form of life, and then he says, if anyone can come up with a simpler theory, like you just said the most complicated thing I can think of,
And meanwhile, you have doughy glasses guy that's over there going, "Are you serious right now?" And then not in so many words, but yeah.
Right. One of the quotes that Royston says is, "It's a particle of mud, but by virtue of its atomic structure, it emits radiation. That's all it is, just mud. How do you kill mud?
Yeah, I like that line.
That's one of the great lines in this.
Oh, and before that, I also want to write down one of my other favorite like little screenwriting moments when he's talking to like the detective, his other scientists, and all this. They're gathering. He's trying to understand, and he throws out that wild theory right before he does it. The other scientist goes, "Don't explain it to me like I'm a schoolboy. We know what this is." It's like, okay, well, fine. He's about to go right to it, but then the detective goes, "Yeah, I wasn't that bright in school, so please explain it to me." I went, "I don't want to tell and not show, and I just want to cut right to it. But then again, I know I need to, so I'm going to have both characters explain why I'm explaining." I love that little moment. It's just such a nice touch.
There's another moment like that I thought was great too, where, you know, they come up with what they've got to do and everything. And the army guy is talking to the other army guys, and he's like, it's Major Cartwright. And he's talking about this. He's like, you know, this Royston chap, brilliant, of course, I'm sure. But the trouble with these scientific types is they can't see the easy way out of anything. It's got to be complicated if it's going to work. He knows that it's a formless thing. It can take on different kinds of shapes. 2 more soldiers are killed while guarding it.
Mm-hmm.
Adam realizes that it needs radiation to exist. Due to the development of nuclear power, there's been radiation above ground that it can get to sustain its life. So where is their radiation? Well, the next closest radiation is their research facility, which houses a cobalt bomb, which I don't know if that's actually a thing, but it sounds like a thing.
It could be a thing. That's what writers go with. It could be a thing.
They want to find it first. They take volunteers. Someone's got to go down into the pit to investigate it. This is where
William Lucas, known for Portrait of Allison, Solo for Canary, and Curtain of Fear.
Okay. So he basically volunteers to go down into the pit. So they set up this winch and they slowly lower him down.
Except at one point when the 2 guys operating the winch just like forget their job for a split second.
Yeah. And he goes like plummeting down. But then, of course, he survived that. As he's going down, he passes like a skeleton. Mm-hmm. And so we're like, okay, there's the remains of one dead person.
One of the soldiers,
so it's like, I had a moment of like lost skeleton of Cadavra, you know, but then I realized that it had killed the soldiers and it would have like taken all their flesh. So I'm like, okay.
Yeah. I mean, did it to the guy or the intern or whatever. So yeah.
So
I sleep now. We start to hear that sound coming from underneath.
The sound, you know, it's kind of the Jaws thing, right? So you hear the sound before you see the creature, and which by this point we haven't seen the creature at all. Yes, that is correct. We have not seen the creature. That's
again, like Jaws.
That's like standard now for monster movies. I don't know if it was standard then, but it makes sense not to reveal, because once you've revealed it, it's like that's that. You know,
you're going to be stuck with it for the rest of the film.
You know, it almost attacks him, but then
the winch guys are pulling him up, and like it's chasing him coming up.
There's a moment of like, is he gonna make it? And when they get him up, the Major's like, just concrete over the whole thing. You know, I'm like, that's
just shooting like flamethrowers down there, or blowing it up and just dumping concrete over it. But they're like,
they think that they'll break through it again.
Dr. Royston does, and Mac. Yeah,
Mac and Adam think that. So this is one of the parts where I'm like, well, you know, if it was going to break through again, wouldn't it break through nearby where it's like regular dirt and not concrete?
Right. Like it split through the earth already. I mean, why would concrete seal it up?
But I think that was their point. Concreting over this doesn't matter. It already knows there's radiation on the surface. It's going to break through in a different spot. Meanwhile, there's some people who, in the days before GPS, we used to have to use a map We would drive.
Yep.
So and you
Yep.
get lost sometimes. So there's people, they got lost and they pulled over and they're looking at this map. And
Those are like early MapQuest, right?
yes. And they get completely dissolved by the creature.
That is my favorite Mac moment in the film. He goes to investigate something, and then this other officer in the background is going, "Oh, it's people being burned," and he stops right at the door, turns around, is like, "What was that?" It's like, "Oh, just some stuff about people being melted or whatever." It's like, "I'm gonna take that call. I'll be right back."
Yeah.
That was the moment that sold me for. I was like, "I love this guy."
Wasn't there a scene where they were both on the phone at the same time?
Yeah, they were
Like-
both on the phone. Like, he couldn't have heard what he was saying.
I thought that was a really interesting scene, by the way, because it's very confusing when two people are talking at the same time. We try to avoid it on this podcast, but we do it all the time. But
Sorry.
like on in the movie, there are two different people on the phone talking to other people at the same time. And so you
And
can
somehow it works.
somehow it works. And you can
Yeah.
only catch part of each conversation at any given moment because you're trying to focus on one or the other. But you're getting little bits of both. So it's kind of cool. It was like something I've never seen ever in any other movie.
There's a lot of use of phones in this. And the one thing I really liked is every time you knew something was about to happen at that location, you'd always hear, "Sorry, the lines are really bad."
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Which, yeah, we're still dealing with that now. Like every time I log on to Zoom, it's like, "Oh, can you hear me? I can't hear you." But so you can only imagine what it was like in the early days of telephones.
Especially when you got like giant radiation interference coming by it as well.
They find out that it is heading for the facility. So they order an evacuation.
Basically, what's going to be in the path from that split to the facility.
Right. And so all the people are going to, in the US, it would be a civil defense shelter. In this, it's like a chapel.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to figure out what they're going to do while everybody's hiding out in this chapel. There's some incidences at both the lab where like a guard
This
is
big
killed.
giant lab, yeah.
And there's also an incident near the chapel where a little girl goes out and
When we saw that Willie didn't survive, that's what got to my wife. The mother just runs inside the building, leaves the little girl out there. The girl goes to the wall, and we're like, well, first off, the mom, not a good mom. Second of all, we know this writer's not above killing kids, so I actually am terrified for what had happened to this kid.
So what you guys have to understand is I don't have kids. John and his wife have a little girl.
We do have-
She's probably about the same age.
Well, she's 9, but yeah,
Okay.
but you do identify with that stage. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that stage, learning to walk, doesn't know the world in front of him. Don't put your hands on that. There's germs.
Don't go over the fence because there's a giant radioactive blob.
When you hear, yeah, this is how radiation works, kid. Stay away from it if you don't have like multiple lead lined suits on.
Sound the spoiler alert. We're basically going to the end. After it's attacked, it goes back underground. Basically, they decide to put a Jeep filled with radioactive bait. They decide to drive a Jeep toward it and lure it back out so they can kill it. But the Jeep's tires get stuck in the mud. Peter's driving it. So again, Peter is
The action hero, yeah.
yeah.
Jeep goes mud and gets stuck.
He manages to break free, and then they lure it to an area rigged with electronic equipment, and they turn on the switch. Explosion occurs, and they think it's destroyed, but then there's a second unexpected explosion, which they can't explain. And remember, this whole thing started with an explosion coming from underground.
Right.
So they basically have destroyed this one, but is it the end? We don't know.
It was an odd note to leave it on because it was literally, oh, that shouldn't have happened. Oh, you should just be glad it worked. The end. I'm like, I don't know how to feel about that.
I was interested in the fact that I don't think they mentioned anywhere in this movie the fact that underground atomic testing was taking place. The first underground test took place in 1951. So
pretty close to like when this was being written.
Yep. That would have been the one little detail that would have put this movie over the top for me if they had referenced underground nuclear testing. And
Right.
maybe they did, and maybe the UK War Office could have said, remember, they worked in conjunction with the War Office. The War Office might have said, yeah, no, you can't have references to underground testing because we don't want people to know.
Right, exactly. It's just like the thing with Kodak, and when they said, "Oh, well, you're testing this," we are. Please don't say anything.
Yeah,
just for the runtime that it has, like for being close to an hour and 20 minutes, like it breezes through really well.
Yeah, overall, I gotta say, I like this better than Quatermass Experiment.
Kind of, yeah, because I think what this one does better than Quatermass is it understands that the horror elements were what made it a lot stronger. They knew they had a good base with the science fiction story, but they leaned into the horror elements big time. And Hollywood has and hasn't caught onto it yet, in the sense that they know to make a profit, lean into horror. They don't recognize it when it comes to awards, though. When you mentioned, oh, this is the next film to watch in our sequence, I was excited because a couple years back during the pandemic, my wife and I watch Mojo on YouTube, and they did a thing, the greatest movies A to Z. They didn't do like a top 20 or whatever. This was just like, they wanted every letter to encompass every aspect of a genre, and they did horror. When it got to X, I was like, oh, what starts with X? That's a horror film. And it showed that clip of Willie in the woods from X the Unknown. And I was like, this looks kind of cool. I was like, I wanted to see it. And while watching it, I realized not only was it cool, not only did it belong on the list of horror because it was one of the earliest sci-fi horror films, this also predated The Blob.
Yes. This was the start of a whole bunch of Blob films. There was this, there was The Blob the next year. The year after that, there was Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster. So there was a bunch of Blob films that came out after this. Yeah.
This is a movie that it's a pretty good science fiction film, but it's a really effective horror film. This is where the writing was on the wall that Hammer was about to go full horror.
Yeah. The British film critic, David Peary, he wrote his review of this in the Time Out film guide. He wrote this later, looking back at this film, but he said in 1956 was the year of the Suez Crisis, a sharp increase in the crime rate and uneasy preparation for World War III spawned a series of gloomy thrillers both in Britain and in America, in which the weight of the military is mobilized against various alien organisms from the bowels of the earth or outer space. In a lot of ways, X the Unknown communicates the atmosphere of Britain in the late 50s more effectively than the most earnest social document. So, yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, is that this era of paranoia
still there. Like, and again, like we have these Senate hearings on, the Red Scare at the time, McCarthyism. Not only that, but we're also roughly 10 years from the ending of World War II, which the ending to that was signified with a giant bang, 2 giant bangs in Japan. And it's kind of terrifying to realize, if we get into another one of these wars, that's the card that could be played. And it's terrifying.
There's definitely this overwhelming sense of dread, and I think the film captures it really well because the black and white photography, of course, everything is black and white at this time, but the black and white photography in this is really well done. It's like there's a lot of emphasis on the darkness. Like a lot of this thing happens at night.
And the other thing I wanted to point out was it opens up in the daytime, which for a horror film to open in the daytime and still manage to actually have a pretty tense moment in the day, that's challenging.
I think a lot of horror films open at night and then it cuts to the next day to the people who don't know what's going on. And then slowly they learn about the horror. And then the next night that happens, something happens. And then it keeps happening like that until you're all night. Right. This opens in the day, then it's night after that. And almost everything happens at night. The boys going to the tower happens at night. The guards on posted at this thing happen at night.
The scene in the woods, the reason why I said I thought like from what I saw in the Watch Mojo clip, looked really good. That entire sequence in the woods, the way it's lit is gorgeous, especially in black and white.
Who knows? This might have been a much bigger film if it had beat Invasion of the Body Snatchers to the box office, because it has that same sense of dread and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I want to remind everyone that you can find us on just about every major podcasting platform. Whatever platform is your choice, it would be great if you could leave us a review, because that is what lets the algorithm know that people are actually listening to the show and helps other people find the show. Or just tell somebody about the show. Get one other person to listen to the show. And if you want to talk to us directly or whatever, you can email us at GC8podcast. That's letter G, letter C, number 8 podcast at gmail.com. Until next time, this is Eric.
And this is John.
Signing off. There's no such thing as getting killed by a car in the Fast and Furious saga. As long as you touch a car, it's like home base in Tag when you were a kid.